Welcome, Augies Worldwide, and thanks for joining us here. We're going to go through some questions together with our Ask Dave editor, Trevor Ullman, who is joining us. He will soon be going back to BYU to film school, so we're enjoying his company here for the last couple weeks before he goes. If you want to send a question, send it to hamradioanswers@gmail.com. And that goes to Trevor, and he correlates them just as he's done with these piles on the desk here. And we'll go through them in some videos. So Trevor, what do you have for us?
All right, so Joe, call sign KN4ODA, wants an antenna recommendation.
Oh boy, antenna recommendations. The problem with antenna recommendations is that they're very specific to a person, very specific to a location. He is pretty much settled on the FT991A radio, which is a nice radio. Questions about antennas. Non-HOA neighborhood with a half an acre. Okay, I'm able to put up a tower, and I'm leaning toward one of the antennas you recommended, the high gain AV640. You don't need a tower for the AV640. The AV640 would be a good one to start with, and it will last you a long, long time into your amateur career. I have a vertical by Butternut, and it has lasted me well over 20 years. Let's see, I got it before I was married. I've been married 22 years, so it's 25, 26 years old. And it just keeps on working and has been my station antenna for years. The high gain AV640, everybody I have talked to who has one likes it. So yeah, that's a fine antenna, and I would recommend that as a good way to get started.
All right, Clayton, call sign NF1R, wants your thoughts on the Cushcraft SR series.
Cushcraft has just introduced an SR series of monoband, tri-band, 5-band beams that look an awful lot like the Force 12 C3 style knockoffs or clones. The answer is that the Force 12 intellectual property has kicked around since the demise of Force 12. They were just up the road from us here up in Grand Junction. It's landed at 2 or 3 different places and has now landed with MFJ. So they're the same antennas built to the same specs. I don't think you would go wrong with them. They're not entry-level antennas. There are lots of comparisons across the product line. You want to look at the gain over an isotropic antenna that's expressed as dBi. If it's expressed as dBd, gain over a dipole, you can just add 2.1 dB to that to get the gain over an isotropic antenna. You also want to look at the front-to-back ratio. Make sure that you're cutting out any interference that you might be getting from the back lobe. There's lots and lots and lots of beam antennas out there. Research them, find one that looks good for you. Don't take too big a bite in your first try. Remember, these antennas are huge. I put up the MFJ's Hex beam out in the backyard, and it was twice as big as anything I've ever dealt with, and turned out to take an entirely different mounting technique to get the thing up into the air. So be careful, they're very large.
Bob, call sign WA2RNA, would like an antenna analyzer recommendation.
Well, he says that there are lots of antenna analyzers out there, which is true. There are lots and lots. He says before he buys some nice equipment which will actually allow him to transmit, and yes, he does have his license, he's WA2RNA. The MFJs are kind of the standard. The MFJ 269C would be a fine antenna tuner. It doesn't do some of the graphing that the Rig Expert and others like that do. It just works. You have to tune manually across the band and note where the 2 dB points and the 3 dB points are. They're relatively inexpensive compared to some of the others. Unless you want to get into the really fancy stuff where you use a true vector network analyzer, then I think the 269C would do just fine. I recommend it. I have a 259B that I've used for years, and it's just been rock solid dependable.
Michael asks about an HF antenna.
HF antenna recommendation. He's KM2U, so that means amateur extra. And he is looking at the Gap antennas, the Gap Challenger and the Gap Titan, which are verticals, by the way. They're rather complicated. They've got all sorts of things sticking off of them to make them work on all the different bands. And SWRs are one, and they cross the entire portion of each band except 80 meters, of course. Like any other 80 meter vertical, you will see around 100 to 150 kilocycles of acceptable bandwidth. He's an older ham using the term kilocycle instead of kilohertz. That's the way it used to be. My station antenna, the butternut HF9V, only gives me about 25 to 50 kilohertz on 80 meters. It's almost like not having 80 meters at all. So he's a very satisfied customer of the Gap antenna, and that's great.
Jim, call sign KG6UDW, would like your thoughts on the TAK Tena 40 multiband antenna.
I'm not familiar with this antenna, the Tactena. Obviously, the name is implying some sort of tactical use or field use for the antenna. I have to apologize, I don't know anything about the antenna. There's some antennas out there that are strange that you really don't ever hear people using, and there's often a reason for that. Look up for reviews on eham.net/reviews and see if you can find that particular antenna to get a good review. That review site is excellent. It has just about every piece of equipment ever produced.
All right, Colin asks about what's the best quality coax for an MFJ 1886 loop.
Well, there's all different kinds of coax. Assuming you want 58 coax, for the 1886, I'd recommend RG8X. Would probably be just fine. RG58 might be okay, but I like the RG8X better because it's got a better shield on it. You could run LMR 240 on it, but that's kind of spending a lot of money you don't need to really spend. I'd go with RG8X.
All right, Greg calls in KM4EIR. Wants to know about HF SIG's website purchases.
Yeah, HF SIGs is the outfit in India that is making the BITX 40, which is a 40 meter only, single sideband only, 10 watt at max only transceiver, 5 watts if you feed it with 12 volts. I have one. It's a quasi kit. The board is all made. What you have to do is create an enclosure and attach the various peripherals like volume, tuning, and so on. He says he's having trouble using a Visa, a non-PayPal, which they say they honor, and he's having trouble getting to it. He says, do you know how I can reach them so I can purchase one of their rigs? There is a contact email on their website. Go to their website, poke around a little bit, especially under support, and you should find that email and you can ask your question. It is possible to order through PayPal using a Visa. That may end up being what you do, but they should have that set up for you. So go to their website, hfsigs.com, and look under support to get their email address. They're great people, by the way.
Brad, call sign N6GR, would like to know the benefits of tuner placement.
The two options for tuner placement are in your shack or at the base of the antenna. If you have an antenna that's going to present a fairly high SWR, like a 43-foot vertical, what you need to understand is you want the tuner right at the base of it so that you don't have a feed line in there, because a feed line with high SWR will dissipate quite a bit in ohmic resistance. So if you put the antenna tuner in the shack and you have a coax in between or even ladder line, you're going to get quite a bit of heating in the transmission line. So putting the tuner at the base of the antenna eliminates the transmission line from the equation. So the rig sees 50 ohm resistive, and then the tuner right at the base of the antenna can take care of any reactance. For a 43-foot vertical or something like that, it's kind of recommended to do that.
Donald, call sign KC3SCZ, would like to know about an HF antenna.
Okay, let's see. Live in Pennsylvania, gets a heavy winter. Do you know about the MFJ 1838 cobweb? Well, I happen to have their cobweb antenna. So would like to use digital and voice. Do not know about digital. I did not want to get for ICOM 7000 radio. I like to get on the air and HF bands. That antenna, the 1838 cobweb's fine antenna. Like I said, I've got one and it works just fine. Now the wires, I don't know how well they would stand up to an ice storm. They're not really thick. You can always replace them. If one breaks, you can simply replace it. You can replace it with something thicker if you want. But like I said, I've had mine. It's gone through a winter and it seems to do just fine. So yeah, fine antenna.
All right. Raymond, call sign WFZ or WF7BSR, would like an antenna setup recommendation.
Oh, okay. Well, as far as he responded to a video that's a couple years old. By the way, if you comment on a video, regardless of how old it is, I will see the comment. There's a tool that YouTube has for me called Discussion, which shows me all the comments that people have made, and I can go in there and look at them. Now, if you make a comment to a comment to a comment, it may not come through that way, but if you make a comment directly to the video itself, it will come through. So there's a very good chance I may have looked at this one already. Let's see, he's got a 40-meter dipole, 20-meter dipole over my house in sort of an X configuration, so he can feed two feed lines down through a vent on the roof. By the way, you know that you can very possibly feed both of those with the same feed line. You have to be careful trimming them to get the SWR right, but you can do that. Each antenna will end up a little shorter. The two dipoles will be supported by four fence top rails described in the video, one mounted each corner of the house. Okay, and the Yagi he wants to put in here will be about 8-foot hardened wire antennas, approximately 15 feet away. Okay, will having the two dipoles in close proximity to one another cause issues? Yes, they will affect each other, but you can tune that out. What would be the minimum separation of the two dipoles can get away with? Well, like I said, some people just use one piece of feed line to feed them both, so you can try that. They can be quite close. The feed line point will be one above the other, about 12 to 18 inches away. It should work fine. Also considering making a 2-meter antenna to put in the same mast as the 10-meter Yagi. so the rotor would control both. Is there a minimum distance you want to have between the two? On 10 meters, if I'm assuming correctly, you're doing weak signal work where you're doing digital, single sideband, things like that. The 2-meter antenna is probably doing FM. If that's the case, you want that vertically polarized. And it can be up a few feet. Doesn't have to be really high up above the other antenna. If you are doing weak signal work on 2 meters, you want that to be horizontally polarized, and you probably want that 5 or 6 feet above your 10-meter Yagi. By the way, 10 is kind of dead these days. 6 meters is sure hopping, though, on FT8. You might check out the FT8 frequencies on all bands. They seem to be busy all day. Hope that helped.
Mir asks about an antenna recommendation.
Let's see what we've got here. Let's see. Direct me to a good antenna can use that's very directive aiming into space. Should it be a portable one to mount on the auto-track telescope stand? Unless you're doing amateur astronomy, you would not mount it on a telescope auto tracker. The telescope auto tracker is designed to track stars, but satellites go across the sky much faster. Now, if you have a piece of software like Ham Radio Deluxe and so on, it can point those antennas for you. And you can follow that, but you need both azimuth and elevation motors on that. There are a lot of articles on that. Look them up on the internet. His other option is a fixed antenna in a very big garden. You're going to need some gain to get to the satellites. For some of them, you don't need very much. All of the satellites working right now are in low Earth orbit, so they'll go across the sky. If they could go from horizon to horizon in 15 minutes, so you have to point them very well. There are setups out there. I think Yaesu has something, but other things out there that you can use. You're going to have to do a lot of bespoke construction for that, to make that work. Good luck with your satellite work.
Okay. Chris calls on W7JPG. Has a question about the MFJ 1708 SDR TR switch.
Yeah, I just tested that recently. Tested the original version. There's an A model out there now. Something MFJ points out in their app note for the earlier model. Here's what they say. In receive mode, the rig and the RSP are now effectively connected together in a T configuration. Assuming 50 ohms input impedance for each, the antenna is now being loaded by two parallel inputs at 25 ohms. Inevitably, this also means that the received power will be 3 dB down since it's now shared between the two receivers. I believe they've done something about this in the updated MFJ 1708 SDR. I did not find it to be a problem, but yes, it does tap off 3 dB for the SDR radio. Check the new one out there, the A model or B model or whatever it is, because I believe they've done something about this with an amplifier. But personally don't think 3 dB loss to the main receiver is a showstopper. Well, if you're down near the noise, 3 dB signal loss can be a problem because a lot of the noise is generated at very low signal levels. A lot of the noise that's generated is actually in the front end of the receiver. So if you drop by 3 dB on your signal strength, you could drop it down closer to the noise. So yeah, it does make a difference.
Chris calls on TEOUKH. Wants to know about DMR long distance limit.
2EO, that's a British call sign, yes, UK Gadget. He has done DMR long distance from the UK town of Lowestoft to Utrecht, 145 mile distance to the Utrecht repeater. I've heard it said that there's a limit to the range of a Tier 2 digital system. I've heard that it is 100 miles. I can assure you this is genuine. Okay, he's just talking about a distance that he said. No, there's no distance limit. Any distance limit would be such that it would cause the timing of the two to drop out. And clearly there's a limit. If you have to wait too long for the received signal to come in and for frequencies to lock in, you'll lose lock. And I don't know how many microseconds that is or what that would transmit to in terms of distance. But if you've done a 145 mile length, that's great. Usually 2 meters is limited to line of sight. So if you're up on the side of the hill and you're talking to the correct side of a hill 100 miles away, you can have a very good contact. Of course, you can have the opposite problem when you're just 3 miles away.
All right, Barry, call sign KF4WGR, wants to know about the MFJ Hex.
And he says, MFJ now has a 3-element hex beam. That's a pretty big deal because some operators shy away from the 2-element hex because they want more gain. I have the 2-element hex beam. MFJ sent it along to me to review, which I did. In fact, I made a few videos out of it. Very, very nice antenna. 3-element would presumably be better. I also presume that the 3-element would be bigger. And this 2-element one is pretty big as it stands. There's 2 elements on each of the 6 bands. Doubt the performance would equal a finely tuned 3-element monobander, but may perform just as well as a 3-element multibander. Here what my opinion is on the hex. The 2-element hex I have is a fabulous antenna. I really like it. As you can see in the several videos I made about it, it was a lot more work to get up than, say, a cobweb antenna or something like that. The cobweb was light enough I could basically just pick up the mast with the cobweb mounted and then string it upright with the guys. Couldn't do that. It took 2 of us to raise the hex beam, and we had to create a special, well, sort of mounting device. Bottom line, I like their hex beam. Nice antenna, nice approach, and not so visible. It looks like a great big upside down umbrella without the cloth. Weird.
Greg, call sign KE0HTG, would like to know about using a voltage balun.
Balun. Gotta learn these things here. Recently acquired a Mosley TA33. That is a vintage antenna with the 40-meter add-on kit. Boy, that's would make it pretty large. Also gave him a high-gain voltage balun to use as a connection point instead of shorting one side of the driven element to ground, as Mosley says to do in most of the older guys who have had one said use the voltage balun. Well, fine, use it. It's when I say a legacy antenna, it's been around a very long time, decades, and so there has been a fair amount of, I guess you could call it folklore on what's the best thing to do with it. There's all different kinds of ways of attaching unbalanced coax to a balanced beam. These are reviewed in the antenna book, the ARRL antenna book. Gives you some ideas in there too. You might consult that before you put it up.
Jody, call sign K4EPH, would like to know if Yaesu owned Daiwa.
Yaesu owns Daiwa. I don't know. He bought a rotator from the estate of a Silent Key, hefty piece of equipment. And the package included the rotator, the control box, and all the wiring. Well, you're lucky you've got everything. The manufacturer's Daiwa is the model here, and the controller's been looking for an operating manual for that setup and has found nothing. Daiwa, whom I know manufactures fishing reels and fishing gear, doesn't appear to have an antenna rotator business anymore. I don't know. This is a problem with older radios and things like that. You'll have to really dig into the internet and play detective to find that. But if it works and you've got everything for it and you've got all the connections right and everything, it should be fine for you. So that concludes our session here. In channel news, I'm emphasizing Patreon at www.patreon.com/KE0OG. It's a way that you can contribute $1 or $2 every month, and you don't notice it, but it adds up and it really helps me out here on this end. So thanks so much for tuning in. Keep those questions coming to hamradioanswers@gmail.com. Hamradioanswers, all one word, @gmail.com. And we'll see if we can't get an answer to you. Thanks so much for tuning in. Until next time, 73.